Alright, how's it going? If you're watching this, you're probably here to learn a little bit about how you can create a system that's similar to how I'm currently using, or the system that I'm currently using, I should say. Um, so I'm going to go over just a little bit about it. This is going to be kind of a short video just to kind of get you started on how you could create a system that what I'm using. You can go through the tutorials that I have, and you can use a lot of the information that's in there, but there are a few things that I'm doing differently that I think are important and that I'd like to kind of show anybody who's trying to create my tutorial system. So um, right now I've got my project open, and this is my game that I'm building. So I've got this project, and I've got my C++ code open here. And I'm going to show you a few things. I'm not going to go through all my C++, but I'll show you a few things. And as far as the UI part of it goes, that wasn't changed much. I changed it the way that it looks, and I changed a few of the details here and there um, on mine. Let's see if I can find it. I put all that stuff down in here, and I have a ton of widgets. Let's see. Fonts, talent, spellbook, item tooltip. Here we go. Consumable panel, damage panel, defense panel, enchanted panel, item tooltip. So I do things. I break it down. So item tooltip has many different. It's comprised of many different panels. I don't do it all in one because it's easier to just create it in I don't know, and I can't remember how I do it in the tutorials system, but the way I do it now is I've got panels. There's a bunch of panels, and so we have an enchanted panel, and all it does is it holds the title enchanted in case if you wanted to have your weapon or item be able to be enchanted, which in this case it would roll with higher stats than the normal. It would affect the weapon. So, but this is not something that changes. Like the enchanted panel doesn't have anything to do with the it doesn't have any effect on the item, right? The item gets enchanted as it rolls, and then it can tell the UI, hey, I have I'm enchanted or whatever, and so in that regard, it can then draw the panel. Certain panels get created at runtime, like the enchanted panel is always visible unless if I tell it not to be. So it actually starts collapsed and then works its way into whatever it needs to be. So that's kind of how I'm doing a lot of these things. There's this main panel has the rest of it. I think it's just the enchanted panel, but as far as everything else, it gets drawn inside of the additional panels vert box. So I just have a vertical box, and then as I determine what I need, I draw the different panels, and those different panels could be um, they can be primary stats panel, which would look like this. It would have your primary stats, whatever it is. You could have your secondary stats, um, which actually roll the values. They actually get filled at runtime. So like all the code that is populating those values, it's rolling the stats. When the item is created, and then that item comes through here and it pulls those stats here, and then it creates the UI, which is just a text, right? So I can go here, a secondary stat text, and so that can, it's going to draw one of those for each item as it does it. So I kind of draw everything dynamically. It's all programmatically made. That way, it all puts it together, and I don't have to do as much like pre-setup, right? So I mean, there's I'm pretty sure if you're familiar with UIs and stuff, you could do a system like this without me explaining how to do it. I mean, again, it's really just draw things that you need when you need them, and the item would have all that information. So it's like you're going to get the item, and you're going to basically determine what are the things you need to draw on the UI, which is the main panel, right? The one that we have here, that's the main one. So this is probably as far as I'll go into that part of it. But other than that, I mean, those things that they're all, this is we're going to talk about generally the way that I'm building the actual item generation at this point, which is like I said, it's pretty similar, but there's a few things that I did different than in the actual tutorials. So I'll get back to that, and we're gonna go start by, I'll just show you my data. So now the way that I'm doing it in the tutorials, I think I had one item database. It had chunks like 1 through 10 was, could be white quality. 11 through 20 could be, your rare quality, and so forth. And it goes up the numbers until you get to like 40 or 41 or something like that. But what I found was that that system kind of it's a little bit tedious because you have to have all those items set up in the database um, for it to be able to pull them all. And if you want to make changes to the database or the spreadsheet and pull them in, you're going to have to reset up all that database. So every time you pull something in, like a spreadsheet, you have to reset up the database, which means that you got to reapply pictures or icons or whatever it is, the meshes, you got to reslot them in. And so I figured, the easiest way to be able to do this without having to affect all of the other system, without having to affect all the other items, right? So if you need to make a change to resources, well, no, let's say if you need to make a change to the gear items and only the gear items, then why bother affecting everything else, right? So we will have different different databases based on the categories, right? So consumables gets its category, it gets its database. Gear items gets its database, and resource items gets their database, and that allows you to really kind of like narrow it down. And I mean, basically at that point, if you do need to make a change to something in here, and you need to go back to the spreadsheet and pull it back in, at least you're only, it's only going to affect, right here in my case, it's only going to affect 18 items, and I'll have to go back and reapply some of their stuff. But I don't make a lot of changes to the database after it's made. Usually I don't go to the spreadsheet and have to do too many different things, because you can always come back in. If you want to add more items, you can just do it from here. If I wanted to add 19 and 20, you can hit plus, and then it'll add more, and then it'll let you fill them out and stuff. It won't be in the spreadsheet then. You'd have to go and update the spreadsheet if you wanted it to reflect some of that information. But at least you could have them added in here. But if you do go and change the spreadsheet and you add 1920 and then you re-import it, it's going to delete all this information in here. You're going to have to go back. It'll pull the data from these, any of the text that you put in, like the name, the weapon, the offhand, the weapon or offhand type, but the item thumbnail and the mesh and the skeletal mesh, those things have to be replaced in. I mean, it's not super hard. You go to your meshes and you just hit the arrow, click on the one you want, hit the arrow. So it takes a little bit of time, but 18 is better than having to do one giant spreadsheet that becomes a massive headache every time you want to make changes. So definitely spread it out, keep them separate, use separate data tables for every category. This way, you're not going to have a problem. And I even did things like my item IDs. Can't even remember. D3, R3, E3, T3. I forget what I was doing with those. I don't even know. Those were just they were specific ID, like IDs that I was using just to make it easy on myself, so I didn't have to like write a whole name out. Like this is POS or PO small, which was potion small, potion medium, potion large. So those are the IDs that I use for if I need to compare. It's a name. So if I need to compare that variable to another like item or something, it's I can do a comparison. I can use that name right there because the name is going to be cheaper to compare than a string. So I use names for all my IDs. But so one of the things that I did differently, like I was saying in some of that in that title, in that description of that YouTube video at the beginning there, is that I use one item. I don't make a bunch of actors for items anymore. I have a gear item, and I have a gear random, and I have like basically a base class that I can make. So if I wanted to go to, let me check and see. So this is a, this key is basically a resource, I think. No, it's a consumable. Sorry, it's a consumable. So the dungeon key is a consumable. It's a version. It's like a version of the consumable class. And if I wanted to make more of those, then I could just go, okay, consumable. Oops. And so I have a test consumable, and I have an item consumable, and then I have an item base. So item consumable is actually my C++ class that I have, and then test consumable. Let me go back. Test consumable I think is out here. Yeah. So like this would be my consumable class, and it has some little bit of some programming on it, right? But you have your base class. Your base class is the one that has information related to like right here. Your base class is going to have like, do you want to override the item? Item class type. What type is it? It's a consumable. It's a gear. It's a currency. It's a resource. What is it? The item level. The base. Every item is going to have an item level, right? So probably. So my base class has that value in there. The rarity. The overriding the rarity is here. And then if I want to override the rarity, what do I want it to be? So those are like things that, these are all things that are going to be in here, right? So is the item stackable? Okay, if it is stackable, then what's the max stack count? Do I want to override the gold value? If it's, because it has a gold value. So I put a gold value as a variable inside of it, because every item in my game would have a gold value, right? And so I know that obviously that's how you program. I know that if I'm going to have every item having a gold value, then I know that I can put that in here, and then my child classes, which I would create, my test consumable, my gear, and these blueprints. These are just, like I said, they're just blueprint versions of the C++ classes that I have. So when I go into here, my item gear is the gear blueprint that I highlighted earlier is just a blueprint version of this. And the only difference between this and the base class is the fact that in this one I roll all the stats, and I roll the rarity and the values and all the things that I need, right? But at the beginning, I'm going to go through this. I'll pull this up here. So in the beginning here, all I do is, I tell it I need, there's like, this is the constructor. So the construction, it's like the construction script, right? It's just basically the constructor of the C++ class. So in here, I have to actually initialize all my, these are all my defaults, right? In C++, you have to initialize all that. In the blueprint, you're not going to have to do this because they've all been initialized when you put a value in them in the editor there. So then I initialize all these right here. These are my enumerators for certain things, like all my secondary stats. So I initialize them. And so I added, this is basically an array. It's an array of data. So I can pull out of that now, after that point. I can pull any of those out, right? So secondary stat index 4 is going to be critical chance because it goes 0, 1, 2, 3. 0, 1, 2, 3. 3 is the fourth index. So critical chance would be the one that I would pull, and I would assign that a value, right? And those would get done later on, which is going to be something I'll show you. So it's very similar to the way that I do it in the blueprint. If you go through the blueprint and watch, you'll see that I get a row number. I have a row number 1 through 18 right here is what I, for the gear, because again, we go back to the gear inside here, and the gear has 1 through 18 items, and so I just tell it I need to go pull something from 1 to 18. And then all it does now is it applies that information to a gear structure, which is a structure inside here. But I've got all my structures in a specific location. I create a structure in this class, like I create a variable of that structure, but all my actual structures have been declared in a different, they're in a different file. I use a single file to declare all of my structures. It's right here, data constants. So like in my data constants file, I have my gear item, and here is the stuff for the gear item, right? So this is all gear item information, and these are things. Now this isn't stuff that you'll need to really pay attention to that much right this second, but basically, um, this would be, you know, what type of item it is. Okay, that's the enumerator for that, and the enumerator for um, the weapon or offhand type. And this is if I wanted to have a weapon off. I don't even think I'm doing that anymore, so I just left it in here, but I don't think I'm even using it. And there's the rarity, right? The rarity. I have another thing called corruption, so that's like basically another enumerator, right? And then there are basically different types of primary stat. So melee, magic, range. So you could have your primary stat type. That's another enumerator. Your secondary stat type, and that's another enumerator. And then there's the gear data. Gear data is just gear data is just my structure that I use when I pull that file, right, from, or I pull that row, that data information from the data table from gear. It just populates a copy of the structure with all that data. There's my gear type, my item ID, item skeleton mesh, the skeletal mesh, or the regular mesh, depending on what type of item it is, an item thumbnail, item name prefix, item name suffix, item lore, is it a weapon? Because if it's a weapon, we want to apply damage to it rather than defense or whatever, or armor. If it's an offhand, then we want to know, because then we can do other things with it if it's an offhand. And then we can go, okay, well, is it weapon or offhand type? Do we have different types of... This kind of falls back to this here, like weapon or offhand type. So I left that in there. I'm not even using that again. That's just something that I'm not using. But basically, enumerators, you would have all your enumerators for all this stuff anyways, right? If you're gear, you're going to have all these things. Even if you go through the tutorial, you would have a number of these things. You won't have the corruption. You'll have an enumerator for quality, an enumerator for the type, because those are the things that I put in the tutorial already. It's just that, and then you'll have the enumerator for these right here, primary tag or primary stat, secondary stat, and you would have a structure but the structure would be a blueprint structure. See, this is just a C++ structure. It's just a little different. And then I've got another, I've got basically the same exact system for each thing, right? I've got a runestone item, which is very similar, right? It has a structure that contains very similar information: an item ID, an item mesh, an item thumbnail, a prefix and a suffix, and then item lore that I don't even use. A runestone quality. These are just different things that I've decided to put into this specific class. And so I can create an fgear data in my gear, which is in my gear.h. Gear.h here, and fgear data. Where are you? I'm just going to go fgear data. So there it is. That's my fgear data. And so that is that's the oh, sorry, this is get gear data. So sorry, that's not the actual one. This is the one this is a getter for blueprint. When I want to get that structure, I would actually call this getter, because I don't like to just leave things open. So here's the actual gear data structure, right? So this is the U property that I have, which is, in your sense, if you're using Blueprint, it'll just be a structure in Blueprint, and you won't be having, it's not a U. It's not considered a. It is considered a U property, but it's not the same. It's not like this. So, actually, I wouldn't even know if it would be. It's probably not even considered a U property technically. So basically, that's my structure. I pass all the information to it. You're gonna have one of these. So we go back. Actually, no, we go back to my gear item, and all that happens with this, which is a little bit different from the way that it was over there. I think in the tutorial, it would pull an item. that item was going to have it was going to be a specific item. Like if it was a ring, it would pull the ring of a legendary quality or whatever it was, right? It would tell you the rarity. It would roll the rarity, and then it would go and find the item. Well, in this one, it's a little different. It rolls the rarity after it finds an item, so it goes through. It finds the only thing that I do here, basically, right? I'll go through this whole. This is exactly what's happening. As soon as the item is spawned, right? The item is spawned right here, and it runs begin play, just like in Blueprint, right? Super begin play means so it's going to call its master. Its parents begin play. So this is an actor, right? So super means call your. It's basically like calling the parent function, right? So it's going to call the actor, the main actor class, tell it to run its code, and then it's going to come down and run everything that I've told it to run. But the thing is that because this is actually an item base, it's going to run everything from the item base, which is then going to call the same thing, super, which is going to call the actor, which is going to run that. And I'm going to go to my item base, and in item base we have, let's go back to the top here, because on this one all you're really going to have is, your on begin play is, you might not have hardly anything actually. I have an on-clicked thing that I added so that when you click the item, it knows that you're clicking it. Well, it's a little different in Blueprint, right? So that's the case. But there's nothing really else happening, right? So the main functionality for the item, these are my getters and setters. I'm incrementing the stat count. I do a lot of functions that I know are going to be needed in all the classes. I'll put them in the base class because then you can call them from, the child classes. The thing is, you could do this differently. You could leave these empty, and then you could, but you don't need to, right? Because if you're going to increment a stat count, there's probably not going to be a necessity for every type of child to change this function. So this doesn't need to be a virtual function. This can be a regular function that you can call from any of your child classes. So there's certain ones that I do that with. Increment stat count, decrement stat count, increase stat count by, I think it's, if I want to increase a stat count by a certain number, I can tell it to do that. I want to decrease the stat count by a certain number. So there's obviously add 1, minus 1, and then add a certain number, minus a certain number. And then there's functions for like when I grab loot and store it in a container. But let's just talk about spawning the item, right? So what I built was a simple function called setItemDetails in the base class. Now let's get back to what we were talking about, right? In the item gear, we've spawned the item. Well, we're going to go through here and we're going to go, okay, well the first thing we want to do is, do we want to override the item? Number one, are we overriding the item? Did we go in here in our class, in our test consumable? Actually, let's pull the gear because I'd rather just check. We're going to be pulling that. So let's go to the gear. And I have two different types of gear. The only reason why I have two different types of gear, one random, one gear, is this one I override the item, and the random one does not, right? So this will be a random item. It will pull from the data table at random, and then it'll assign a random value, right? The gear is just a Blueprint class that I've overridden with a specific thing, right? I want it to spawn gear. I want it to be level 1, and I want it to override the rarity, and I want that rarity to be the epic. So every time I place this item into the world, anytime I place this in the world, it's going to be random every time, like every time. And it will be, it'll sometimes, let me find out if, let me see, because the only thing that I'm trying to remember with this is, you come down here, right? So I have these are details for the gear, right? And so you can add your details for the gear. This is how you change each item, right? All the child classes. So I'm going to try to get back here to the process of the spawn in just a second. But basically, we had our base item details. So everything is getting that, right? Your gear item is getting that. Your consumables getting that. Your runestone, whatever it is, your resource item is going to have all these things, right? Do they need to stack? What are they? So then when you get down here, each one of your classes is going to have a specific whatever class details. This happens to be gear, so it gets gear details, and that's just based on the category that I named it. So when I go to gear, item gear, if I go here, I just put gear all my U properties are just labeled gear details, so it's basically throwing it under that category. You can make your own category over here in Blueprint, and you can put your Blueprint variables in here and categorize them as gear details, and then they'll all show up in whatever in this section here, and which means then you'll have the same thing that I have basically, and your structure is going to be one of those variables, right? So that structure, when I clicked override item, now this is the only part that's kind of funny because you can override the item here, and what that does is it still allows you to come down here and modify your stuff here. You're overriding the item here. If you don't click this, it's not going to use any of this stuff down here because of the way that I designed it, right? So in my spawn, that's why I'm checking. Do I want to override the item? Because if I do, then we're going to skip the pulling of the item from the data table. If and if I don't, then we're going to go pull an item from the data table at random. So basically, let me go back, close this. So let's just say with this one, I overrode the item, right? And so that means that I have to come down here and modify these values. And so in your data structure, you're going to want your system to kind of look like this. I have another thing, like I said, I have this thing called augmentation. That's the corruption. I can modify the state of the corruption and change those values based on just being things that that I've created. They're just enumerators, and all it does is, hey, when I click this, it checks the state of the corruption, and it's all based on in C++. So it runs through the process right here, and I'm going to go through that here in a few. It's going to go through here, and every single thing, basically, all the checkboxes out here, it's going through and it's going to be doing that here. It checks them, and then it also does a couple other things, but I want to make sure that. So basically, I'm not sure where I do augmentation state technically, but I know it's actually working. I think I call it determine rune sockets. No, that's not rune socket state. Necklace set prefix. Roll for enchantment. And see, these function names are just named the way that they just help me out remembering exactly what they do. But so let's go on to our things, right? So let's say we're not overriding the item, so we're skipping this part. We're not getting an item from the data table. If I want this item to be a different weapon, different looking weapon now, I would pick what I want it to be because I'm overriding it. And so in your structure, in your blueprint, it would be something similar to this, where your blueprint would grab your structure, and the structure is going to be technically empty until you modify it, right? And so if you've overridden the item, then your structure, you can go and modify the version of the structure that exists here. If I just went and zeroed this out, there wouldn't be an item. It wouldn't have any data, right? But it's sitting in the world. And technically actually, so this version right here is, oh crap, I'm on the axe, but this version right here is the gear. This is just the blueprint, and that was just the axe that I happened to click on for that blueprint, right? I don't even need to have anything in here if I don't want to, because the way that it works is this one has this clicked, but if I were to click on here, I can go back down in here, and I can go to my settings, just the same. Here's base item details, right? They're still there. And that's one of the things about like Blueprint. It's going to show up here if you make it exposed. If you make it instance editable, then you could click on the item while it's out in the world, and you can still change it out there. So you don't technically have to go to the Blueprint and modify all that stuff on the Blueprint. You can modify it on each individual item. And so I would go here and be like, okay, well, I want to change this to a sword, right? And now it's going to have that because I'm overriding it. So then when we turn around, there's the sword, and it's going to use that mesh because of that. And so Oops, that was the wrong key. And so there it is, right? And then it just goes through and rolls its all of its values, damage and everything, because that still works pretty much the same as it did even in my current tutorial system. But as we go through here, you'll see. So all it's really doing is it's taking that one item that you placed on the ground that was just a blueprint, right? That you edited and modified it, an instance of it, and you came through, you told it you wanted to be overridden, and then you go, okay, let's set the gear type, because we're we're going to need to set everything individually because we're overriding. So every one of these functions that happens in a row here, basically all of these are just doing something to let the item, like basically alert the item and set it to all of its values that you've given it in the instance, right? For the item type, it was the base. Oops, they're down here. Yeah. So right, it's going to be gear. So it's like it goes set gear type. Well, what is the gear type? It's actually going to be a main hand. Gear type is a main hand, and that's in the structure. So in your structure, you want all these things like gear type, item ID. Item ID actually doesn't matter because I might not be doing that. I might not even be using that right now. I was using it at one point, but I'm probably not using it now. So, but you do want, your mesh, your skeletal mesh, your mesh, whatever. Because if you have a skeletal mesh, you might want to use that. And if you have a regular mesh, for a sword, you might want to use that. And then a thumbnail, a prefix, and a suffix. And then if you want to have some lore information, it can pull all this data. At least it's there, right? So basically, you set the gear type and you use the structure that existed already, right? That we've set. You didn't go and pull a data table information and replace it, right? We're using what we have here. Then we go and determine the rarity. Well, determining the rarity, and all we're doing is we're basically just making a random rarity with under certain conditions, right? So first of all, I have there's a couple things. One thing is I always pass the loot spawner to my item. So when you create the item, if it's a loot spawner, what you want to do is the thing that I'll just say this here now because it's important. If you're watching this video and you've already started working on the tutorial and you got to the point where you started creating a loot the generation system and you have a loot spawner, go back and change that loot spawner to a component. An actor component, actually, I should say. An actor component. It does not need to be an actor. Make it an actor component. Attach it to anything that you're going to be wanting to spawn loot. If it's an actor that's a character, attach it to the character. On death, call the function spawn loot that you create. Spawn loot, all it does is goes through and takes any of the values that were in the loot spawner component, like how many items, and actually those are values that are actually in the tutorial. They're almost the same. So if you've watched part of the tutorial and you saw that part of it, then you're going to take that information from that tutorial you could even use, right? You're going to want how many items are we spawning? Are these the primary items? Do we want to spawn a set of items first and then another set of items afterwards? So if we do, we can do that. You can program that however you want. But if it was as simple as like I just want to spawn a number of items, it doesn't matter, we're only going to spawn a number of items and we just want it to have that number, then you could tell it to have that number. You can tell the spawner to have that number, and then when the item dies, it calls spawn loot. All it does is goes, okay, we're running a for loop and we're spawning an item, and we're going to put a delay in there, or however we're going to do it. We can do it on a timer, actually. I think it's better to just do it on a timer. Or put the spawn loot and then run the timer, run the function every like 0.3 or 0.2, whatever it is, I don't know, 0.1 and 5 or something, right, of a second. So that way it's going to spawn them in succession, but not all at once, and it's not going to freeze up the game if you tried to spawn 100 of them all at the same time. But basically, it takes the item, the number that you told it to spawn, and it just spawns them. and then instead of telling it to go grab an item first and then spawn that item, it's just gonna spawn what you tell it to spawn. So your loot spawner is gonna have a base item class. That's what it can take. That's what it can spawn. And that base item class can be any of the things that are the children of it, right? The gear, the consumable, and so um, in my loot spawner, I'll just go over this. But we're gonna go back to the gear here in a second. Okay, so actors, spawners, where is it? I got a lot of things. Not abilities. I have this. There they are. They're under components. I put components. Okay, so loot spawner and spawner. I want to see what's going on here. So we have loot spawner component, parent class, and this is loot spawner component. I have two different ones. I don't know why I have two different ones. I think I'm using the spawner. So let's just say, I know that these actually have spawners on them. Yeah, so I'm just using a spawner component, which is inherited by the master actor that I created. So like, you know, you would have your here they are, spawners. I don't know why these are not under actors. So I have a base actor. I have a base spawner. I have a base spawner, and this is an actor. And then I have a client open lid. Well, these are different things. Let's just not focus on multiplayer at the moment, but or any of that crap. So basically, the base spawner, all it has is a function so that you can tell it to do different things. So on event client open lid, you want that function in there. You want that custom event, but you're not going to do anything on it in here because it's the base. You just want it to be there so you can override it for all of your children, right? So you can have chest spawner base, which is, in fact, I'm trying to remember, this is item spawn actor base. Chest spawner base is item spawn actor base. Yeah, so chest spawner base had some functionality for, like, I click on it, and then, I'm sorry that this is going to be probably hard to take all in, but at least it'll be in one video and you can kind of just reference it, pause it, and look at the code if you're having trouble. But basically, you know, this is like a parent that's underneath. This is the child of the item spawner base. This is the item spawner base that has, let's go here, item spawner base, which is actually, you know, it's a component in C++. And so, again, I'm having to kind of go here because these are where they're at. I'm just going to see if I can show you. I'm going to have to go find it. Item. Okay, so loot, where is it? Loot spawner component. So this is my C++ class. The loot spawner component has functions like spawn primary item, and spawn secondary item. Well, these are, again, like, if do you want it to spawn, you know, two different types of items, like do you want it to spawn a gear item and do you want it to spawn like gold, right? And then how much of each you're going to apply that later. But basically, it's very similar to the way that the tutorial already existed with, like, there's a primary loot database, like these are the things that you could pick, that it can pick from, right? You want to allow it to be able to spawn a certain number of things. I'll try to show you that here. If you click on spawner, right? So my primary loot table consists of random gear, right? But I have other options. I could tell it to spawn, you know, any of my blueprints that existed, right? So if I wanted to add to that, I could. I can go, okay, well, I also want it to spawn a key, you know, and then, but the thing about this system is, this is kind of how I do it in the tutorial, actually, but the thing about this system is, if you want it to spawn only one dungeon key, and you want it to spawn, you know, gear as well, then you wouldn't want to put the dungeon key in with this, right? Because it's going to pick either one of these every time it spawns. And so if you were to say, I want it to spawn between 1 and 10 items, well, now it could pick 9. It could roll 9 items and then go, okay, I want a gear item or a dungeon key. You know, and it's going to go back and forth, and it's going to pick until it reaches 9. So if you're going to do it that way, you would get rid of this altogether, delete that one, just keep the one item there, and then on your secondary loot table, you would put the dungeon key. And now it'll roll, you could say 1 to 1, and now it'll only roll 1 dungeon key, and then it'll also roll, you know, between 1 and 10, right? And so I can go out here, and I can come over here, and I can click on that one, and it rolled 1 dungeon key. See that? Right there. So everything else came out before that. It rolled 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 items. Just like I thought. And then it rolled 1 dungeon key at the end. So, where the fuck is my thing here? Okay, so basically, let's click back on that item, right? So our spawner component is going to consist of the similar things, like I said, let's just go over this again, similar things to what are currently in the tutorial already, a primary loot table to grab the items from, the loot minimum and maximum amounts of each of those, how much do we want to override the item? Now we're back to where we were when we took this tangent, okay? Do we want to override the item? If we want to override the item from here, then we're telling the item itself that we no longer want it to be a random item. Even though we're saying that we're going to use a gear random, we're telling whoever's developing, whoever's designing, if they click on this, they're going to say, okay, whoever set this up wants to override this to be an epic item, right? Which means that if I come over here and click on it, it's going to spawn out all epic items. Do you see that? Every single one of them is now an epic item. And that's because, except for that key's not going to be epic. But they're all epic items because we overrode the item, right? So, so now this comes back to where we left off at the in here. Okay, this is where we were. Now I'm going to go back here. I'm going to get us right back onto the task of talking about the spawning, right? So right here, we were at the point where we were going to determine the rarity, right? That was a big tangent, by the way, but I had to get that kind of sorted so that you guys know exactly what we're doing here. So basically, we go, is there a loot spawner? Or first of all, okay, are we overriding the rarity? If we're not overriding the rarity in the item, this is the only part that's kind of weird because it's like there's 2 different places where you override it, right? You could override it in the chest or you can override it in the item. But the thing is that in my head and in the way that I like to work with this is if I'm telling the item to be overridden, okay, then I don't want the loot spawner to override it because obviously I overrode that item for a reason. So I created an instance or a blueprint version that I was going to spawn, and I've specifically set it to always override. I want it to do that. I don't want you to go and change it by changing the loot spawner and spawn that item and then it not be what it's supposed to be. So so that's why first we check to see if the item is not overridden, right? If we're not overriding the rarity. That's for the rarity only though. And then, so again, that's not for the whole item, but that's for the rarity. So then, because first of all, we're just determining the rarity right now. But basically, we go, okay, is there a loot spawner? Did we get spawned? Am I an item that was spawned, or am I an item that was already in the world, you know, when we started the game? Because we need to know that, right? If there's no loot spawner, we can't go and try to grab the information from it. So if we were spawned, we want to know we had a loot spawner. If we had a loot spawner, then we go, okay, well, if not loot spawner, gear override rarity, right? So we're overriding the gear rarity here. If we're not overriding the gear rarity, if we're not coming over here and clicking this, if we're not doing this, okay, then we're going to make a random rarity, right? Sounds obvious, right? So we're going to make a random rarity. And that function, all that's doing, I'll go to it in a second, but all that's doing really is making a random rarity. I'll show it to you. And then if we are overriding it, then we're going to go item rarity equals a loot spawner gear rarity, right? Well, where's that? Right here. It's going to be in your loot spawner component right there underneath it. So when you click that, you're going to set it to what you want it to. That should be in there, inside of your loot details in your spawner that you make. And you should be pulling that information from the loot spawner. And at that point, you should have a loot spawner because you've already made your conditions to check and make sure that your loot spawner exists and that you're not an item that doesn't have a loot spawner, right? If we dropped this in the world over here, there isn't going to be any way for you to tell the loot spawner to override it because it's not being spawned by a loot spawner, right? And again, this loot spawner component can be placed on anything. So it can be placed on the characters that I kill. It can be placed on any of these boxes here. It can be placed on a chest. Anything that you want it to be placed on, you just make the actor for it. So I made a chest spawner base, and that chest spawner base then has I'm pretty sure all these are chest spawner bases. So like treasure chest red, treasure crate, right? They all do the same thing, but they open differently. And so I needed to make children of those so that I could have them run custom functionality on how I want them to open. The two treasure chests are actually very similar in the way that they open. They're actually not that different, I don't think. And in fact, that is why the treasure chest red is just a child of the treasure chest. So it's going to run the same functionality that is in here. And so, this one plays a sound and opens, plays a certain sound and opens a specific way. And then the treasure crate is going to be a child of the chest spawner base, again, because it needs to, on client open lid, it needs to play a sound. Maybe it's a different sound, and it needs to open a different way because it's not the same, right? The treasure chests open a completely different way. And so let's just, for example, let's just put this here, rotate it around, and I think that this item already has predetermined stuff. So this one opens up, like a treasure chest opens up, and then these pop open and fold back. So it's like, or slide backwards. So they're going to open differently. And so they need to both have that overridable custom event that you can run your code on. And then you can make your children of anything that is going to be very similar. If this like you make a different version of it, you can prepare it to have other settings like the what the fuck? Where's my well, basically, oh yeah. You don't put anything. I made this one because I don't even remember why I made this as a separate one. Technically, I could have just gone in here. I think I made it because I wanted to use these other meshes, and I just wanted it to be a prefab, basically. Like, hey, I can just drag this red one into the world anytime I want to now, and it's still going to do the same thing. It's just a red one. I don't have to go in and change the meshes each time on the chest and the lid. Because that's tedious, right? So I just made an extra one, and it's just a red one, and I can drag and drop that one in the world. So let's go back now, because I think hopefully you'll kind of understand the treasure chest part of it. Because again, this spawner, this is a treasure. That's the treasure chest. That's not the thing that's actually spawning the item. That's just an actor in the world that holds the spawner, and the spawner is a component, right? So let's go back to the spawner, and the spawner is the thing that you have those values and all that stuff that you need to have in here, which you should be able to take a screenshot of this and you can load it up with your stuff. So we're gonna go back. So we're done with this. We're gonna go back to make random rarity, and I'm gonna actually go to that. Okay. So make random rarity is really just going, okay, float probability fmath frand. Well, that does a 0 to 1, It returns a random float between 0 and 1 inclusively. And so it should be a decimal value. And then I just go, hey, based on that probability, and whatever I rolled, and then I have my probabilities for each type. So if I have epic probability is a certain number, and those are actually established at the very beginning, right here somewhere. Right, I have actually, where did I put those? Those may be in the base item, but I don't remember. I'll take a look here. Let's go up here and find out. Oh, so epic probability, yeah. So there's my probability values, right? I just put them in here because gear can roll with probability, with a color, a rarity, whatever. Um, and maybe you want consumables to roll with a quality, right? And so you're going to want to have those probability values accessible to your other classes. And so I put them in here so you don't have, so they're there and you can grab them and you can use them in your consumable class or your resource class. And so if you want specific, like if you want a consumable, maybe you want a potion that is, uh, you know, a legendary or epic quality or whatever, and so you can access those and you can do the same exact thing inside the consumable. You can tell it to roll a random value, roll a random rarity and stuff, or you can just assign all your consumables to be always common, always white items, whatever you want to do. Let's go back to gear again. So then we're going to go back to set item. So we're going to go back to begin play. There it is. So we're back here. So we've done set gear item. We've determined the rarity override state. Now, one of the things that is going to happen, this is what tells the item what it is, right? Set item details is that function that I created in the base class. I think I talked about this, but let's go over it one more time if I didn't. So set item details. Set item details. Set item details is a base class function, and the details are the things, right, that you were overriding or messing with when you were creating your item out here in the world, like my sword. The item details, right? These are the things that are for the base item. I think. Let me make sure that I'm saying this right before I continue. Okay, so the item ID. Okay, so it's these. It's the item details right here. So it's your structure basically. So it's basically just your structure. The item ID, the item class type, gear type. Well, okay, it's more than just the. Sorry, I shouldn't say. It's more than just the gear item, the structure. It is also some of this stuff like the item class type. There's a few things here and there. The things that you need to pass to the main class, because this function is gonna be called and it's gonna set everything, right? So you pass in an F name, you pass in a class type for the ID and the class type, the enumerator class type, the lore, the image, the mesh, and then it goes and does what it needs to do, right? That applies all the values, all the details that you generated when you pulled the item from the location, or the ones that you're pre-using by using what is currently in your blueprint of your gear here, or whatever you set up on that particular instance, right? So whatever we messed with, if you're not going to override it. Or I mean, if you are overriding it, I should say. If you're not doing a random one, then you're going to be pulling that information. If you don't change that information, you never do anything with it, it's going to all be empty. So then this here, so this goes through, and then I check, to make sure that these things exist, because if you don't, you need to do that in C++, because if you don't, then you'll crash the engine. If it tries to pull if it pulls a null reference or a null pointer, it'll just crash the engine. So you want to make sure that they exist first. In Blueprint, you don't really have to do that. It'll just tell you, hey, access none. So we set the item mesh component. It's just a function I pass in the mesh, and it calls set static mesh. Right? That's not something that's hard to know how to do. And so let's go back to the top. And actually, sorry. This is the function that's in set item in the base class, right? So your base class has that function, but what you're doing is you're calling it and you're saying gear data.item ID, item class type, gear data.item lore. The item class type is being set by this, so you don't need gear data. That's not in your structure. The item class type was a value that came from your base class that you just set when you created that item and set in the world or whatever, right? That's also going to be something that's in your database. I think has that in it. So when you go to like data and you go to gear items, database has the gear type. Where's the class type? Maybe it doesn't have. Okay, not anymore. Okay, I don't do that like that. That's right. So you don't need that in there. It is just one that you set when you create an item. So like if you go to your blueprints, you're gonna have you're gonna create your child actor, and it's gonna be a gear. And in the gear, this could be your gear base, right? I wouldn't even mess with it. I wouldn't say that it's your gear base. I would just say, okay, I'm gonna make a gear item and a random gear item, whatever I'm gonna do, or whatever you want to do. But just make sure that when you do go make these, that you do go in here and set your item class type to gear. Because if it's not set to gear, then it's not going to be a gear item, right? It's not going to know to run. It's still going to know to run other code, but it's going to be the wrong type, and then that'll confuse a lot of other things that are happening down the road, probably. So, and then the UI, it might, if you have text showing that it might be displaying the wrong information. So you pass that information in. This is what sets the item, sets all that, and then some of these other functions like determine my rune socket state, that just allows me to place a rune socket into the item, which is another thing that I have where it creates a socket. I don't really need to go over that because that's just another addition. All you're doing is adding another variable. Does it have a rune socket or not? If it does, then when the menu is created, it can draw that, but that's more than you would need. Like you can play around with stuff like that on your own. Correct ring and neck scale is just something that I do because all the items are too small, right? So if they're like rings and necks, they're going to be tiny on the ground and you won't be able to see them. So I scale them up. That's nothing. That's all that's doing. Set prefix and names or suffix names. So I'm taking that data that I got from my from here, right? It's in that gear details that you've already filled out or have in your data table that you pulled, and you're just setting it. That's all that's doing. It's just taking those names and setting the text. So those values are getting set in the item. Then when you go to the UI, it just pulls those variables and just displays them. It's not, the item has all this information inside of it, so that when you need to replace it into the UI, like anytime the UI has to redraw itself or do anything like that, it can pull the information from the item, right? And then you roll for an enchantment. All that does is goes, enchantment roll for in its fmath. It's basically an fmath function. It's random range between 0 and 1. So I could have done f range or f random, and it would have done a 0 to 1. And then all I do is if the enchantment roll is less than or equal to 0.5, so it has a 50% chance to roll enchanted, right? And then I go, okay, B is enchanted is equal to true. And then when the UI and other things like get random get random values, so get random value from rarity, which is one of the next things on the list. So it rolls for enchantment. The UI is going to be able to pull that boolean, and it's going to be able to display the part of the UI that it needs to show when it's like that, right? And then set primary stats. Well, That's the next thing, right? So we know it's whether it's enchanted. We go down here. We want to set the primary stats. Well, the primary stats are going to be damage if it's a weapon, armor if it's not, and then the primary stat and stamina or whatever you've got, whatever you've decided, right? And these are values that are basically getting a random value from a rarity. Every single one of these, set armor, get a random value from a rarity, get a random value from a rarity. That's all they're doing. They're just getting a random value. This is the same function being called by multiple other functions. So you get a random value. All it does is it goes and checks, hey, do we have an enchanted item? That's the first thing, right? We need to know if we're enchanted because we need to apply like an offset to it. Well, if we are enchanted, then we want to raise our base value, right? So if we're not enchanted, we're going to have a base value of 1. If we're going to be enchanted, we're going to have a base value of +4 or plus equals 4, right? So it would be like 5. So then we go and we take our random stat. We make a random stat variable here. You can do this however you want to roll the values. This is just the way that I'm doing it. But basically, you take your random stat value and you do a random range base value, right? So what was it? Was it 1 or 5? And then you multiply. You take. So for this, if it was not enchanted, it would roll from. It would get a random number from 1 to 10. If it is enchanted, it's going to get a number from 5 to 10. So if it's an enchanted item, you're always going to have that better roll, right? So that's how I do it, but I also go base value plus 10 on the rare, and then the uncommon, plus 20 on the rare, plus 30 on the epic. So basically, it takes 35 to 40, or otherwise it'll be 31 to 40, and 21 to 30, 11 to 20, or if you were to do enchanted, it would be like 20. It would be 15 to 20, 25 to 30. So it's always going to be like a 5 range instead of a 10 range if you have an enchanted item. It's, you don't even have to do enchantments. If you don't want to, then you just don't do them. You leave it out. And then get random percent value from rarity, which basically just does kind of a similar thing, and this is actually for something that when you need to get a percent value, it pulls that for the secondary stats, like, oh, I need 6% haste. Okay, well, you're going to do the exact same thing. The only difference this time is that you're basically going to have decimal values, and you're getting, you're using decimal values at the beginning. So you're never going to have anything above a 1. And then you use those to roll for your secondary stats, right? So get random value from stat threshold. Well, actually, I don't do that. Sorry, I take that back. These are stat thresholds that I have put in specifically for those types, right? So these are rolling your secondary stats. You can do that however you want to. The way that I've done it is, and that's probably the next thing. I think that was the next thing on the list, right? So primary stats, secondary stats. So that's where we're at. Set item color. I'll just go through these real quick. Set item color. All it's doing is, that's literally what it's doing. It's telling it to set the variable that it holds to contain the color. So if it's a purple, if it's an epic item, it's going to turn that color variable to purple, and that way when the UI needs to pull it, it'll be the right color. Set item gold value. Well, there's a variable for that, right? We didn't override it, or we overrode it. If we are overriding it, then we're going to take the gold value that was up here, and gold value would be fucking, in this case, we didn't override the gold value, so that function will probably check that. So, okay, that's funny. I probably forgot that. Item gold value equals FMF floor to float, item level times random value. So I take the item level and I go times a random value of, well, get random value from rarity. Again, it's that same function of get random value from rarity. So what's the rarity? It allows you to make your gold thing, your item be worth more based on the rarity of it, right? But with this one, I actually don't check to see if you're overriding it, which is something I needed to put in here. Like, are we overriding the gold value? Because we want to know that. Because if we are, we're just going to apply whatever's in the overridden value. We would use item gold value rather than, we would just leave it because it's already going to be set. Um, so let's go back to the secondary stats. That's the one where we're at right now, right? So we set secondary stats. This is almost the same as in the tutorial that I've already got, where you have a table of stats and you pull the stat out of there at random, and you fill another array with these new stats. And while you're pulling them out of the data table, out of the database, you're making sure that the new array doesn't contain the one it's trying to pull, right? Because if it already contains it, you don't want it to put it in there again. So you'll take, whatever necessary precautions you need to do. You can check it contains, you can check, contains, or you can do whatever. But you want to do probably like a while loop that runs through it while the database is lower than the total number of stats it needs to have, and it can be different for each kind, right? Your purple, your epic could have, you can get that from the quality from the quality of the item or whatever. So while the item still doesn't have the total amount of stats it needs, keep pulling them from the data table and checking to see if the new one already contains it. And then once that new array is filled up, then we're going to go down and we're going to go, okay, we need to get our. So for each of those items, we're actually doing it at the same time. We're not doing it at the end, but we're going to be getting a value for each of those, right? So we get a stat, we apply a value to it, and we get that value from a random secondary stat threshold. So we get the random value, and we go from that function that was get random value from stat threshold, and all I'm really doing is going, okay, well, I have all my enumerator stats here, and you can go in the enumerator and you can add them to this and then just keep, making more, and then you just reapply them to your, well, in Blueprint it's different, but in Blueprint it'll just be a checkbox and you'll have that switch on int, right? Or switch on enumerator, and it allows you to have a bunch of different lines going out. But essentially, you're switching on the stat that you got because you want to know what stat it was, right? So if I got attack speed, obviously it's going to go here, and then I got to go, okay, well, we're going to, because attack speed, and you could put these values in another file specifically that holds all this data, and you could have them in there and you can pull that, but I hard-coded them in here because I wanted it to just work and I didn't want to have to put any fucking values from another place in there. So basically my random range is, these are specific, right? Every single stat has a specific range. This can be 5% to 10%, 1% to 5%, 5% to 10%. And so each one is going to be different. And it's just going to apply that to it's going to get that random number, and then it basically returns that random number, right? And then when I return that number, it puts it back into that secondary stat function, which was right here. Get random value. Okay, no, that's that one. Here it is. So get random. So I apply that value that was returned to a random number variable here, a temporary variable, and I add that to. See, in here you can add unique, and in Blueprint you can't really add unique. You can kind of do add, and then you can check contains. You can do a contains first before you add. Or maybe, no, you can add unique. What am I talking about? So yeah, you can add unique, right? So it's just going to keep grabbing the ones and making sure that they're unique. And so you just take your final secondary stat values array, which is a different one. You're going to have a stats array and a values array, right? Two different ones. So that way when you go to your UI, which I was in this location earlier, you go to your UI, you go to your item tooltips, and you go to your secondary stats panel, and you go right here, right? Now when you go to populate stats, whenever you do that, whenever you apply all the panels and start, you know, each panel gets brought in, and you tell it to run the code like, okay, set the values, right? You get the gear item, and then you pull the final secondary stats from that and the value that is associated with it, right? So for each loop, you get what stat it is, you turn that into a text from a you got to go toString to text, and then you can initialize the properties of that panel, which is basically just using that information and setting the details, setting the text that's on it, and you're using the index to get the value from that array because you already are in that index, right? So just grab that index that you're currently in and pull it from this array and get that as a percent, and then push that into the stat value. So you have a stat name and a stat value. So now you've loaded your secondary stats, and those values are still in the item, right? So if you needed to check the item to verify that it's correct, the item's always going to contain the values that it was loaded with, and that's never going to change. Those values are going to be there forever. And so we're almost completely done with that, right? So there's not hardly anything left. We go back to the top. You go to begin play. We're almost there. Set. We've already done set item color. We've done set item gold value, and then all we do after that is apply the initial impulse, which is just shoving the item out of the box and into the air. And then I do something called onNative initialized, which is just a it's a Blueprint implementable event. It's basically a custom event in Blueprint that I can call stuff. So when I go to my gear item and I go to the event graph, I have onNative initialized, and then onNative initialized I can activate the particle system and update the particles for the ring and the neck and set particle color, things like that, right? Because onNative initialized is called at the end, right? Everything natively has been set. There's nothing left. The entire item is done. It is a ready to use gear item, and now all we want to do is call some basic Blueprint logic to it's funny, I don't even know why I had this, but basically you could use this for anything. You could use this for particle effects. You could use this to run a little bit of extra other Blueprint logic. And then I have cursor over and cursor over, begin cursor over, and end cursor over, right, to do like rendering custom depths. And of course we have event item on item picked up, which these are functions that happen in a different location. These are functions that happen at the base level, right? The base level, but when I pick up an item, these are things that you're not going to have generally right off the bat. And I'm not going to go into like picking up items and all that stuff. That's a whole different system. But essentially, picking up an item, you would call a function from the base level that says I'm being picked up. The item takes care of itself, does like hides itself, whatever it needs to do, disables its collision and stuff, and obviously you would probably do that on click or whatever it is that you need to do. So yeah, that's literally all there is to the item generation, right? That's it. That was the entire gear, right? Every other function in there is basically a getter, a setter, or a function that was being used inside that begin play list of functions that were being called right there. So I mean, if you were able to follow along through all that, and you were here, then you've got everything to be able to create the gear the way that I do it. And again, doing a consumable, you're going to have a system that almost looks exactly like this, except instead of rune socket, instead of correct ring and neck, you might have other functions. Set item details is going to be there because it's going to also have item details. It's going to have stuff. I'm going to see if I can open my component or my class here. Let's go to actors. Other components. Where's my items? Here we go. Item consumable. So this one has begin play, This one basically does nothing. I mean, all it does is pulls an item from the database because I don't have any. Oh no, sorry, it does do it. What am I talking about? I missed that. It has a smaller, much smaller, right? So I check the same exact stuff. I check to see if it's overridden. If it's not overridden, then I pull the item from the data table. If it is overridden, like if I want it to be an overridden item, then I would set this consumable type, just like I was setting the gear type. Set the consumable type. What is it? A potion? An aura? I mean, what type of thing is it? Is it food? So those things can happen, and then you can set the item level in here, and then you're going to call set item details, just like you did on the gear item. Set item name base. I don't even know what I do there. Oh yeah, consumable data dot item name prefix and name suffix. Set item color, set gold value, and apply initial impulse. Set item gold value base. I don't know why. Oh, I made these functions in the item base class. So I could call them from here, so I don't have to make another function for setting the item gold. So I could have used that. I could have used that function in here. I could set item gold value in here with from using this one. But I think I'd already made it, and it doesn't matter. I could go back and erase it and use the new one that I had made in here. So set item gold value base. Let's go find out. Set item gold value base, right? So item. Oh, that's the name. Where did it go? So item gold value equals 20 times the item level. So that's just a generic function that sets the gold value to a generic number, an arbitrary number, I should say, based on the item level. So it's whatever. And the resources are the same exact way. They're basically just going to be, what does the resource need? Let's give it the information. But again, it all starts with the item is spawned, and then instead of the differences here are, again, in the tutorial system that I've already got online, your treasure chest is spawning an item that it went and found, right? It went to the data table, grabbed an item, and now it's spawning that item that has already been determined what rarity it is based on its location in the data table, right? And then it's assigning its numbers and all that stuff. This system is using, it's spawning the item first, and then the item itself goes through and finds out whether it needs to go grab a data table row or not, and gives itself all the numbers, right? It doesn't rely on the treasure chest to do any work for it, really, other than whether or not it wants to be overridden. And so that's the main difference. I mean, that's basically it. And I know it's super dark now. My light went away here. I kind of hope that helps with understanding my new system. This is a much more efficient system. It's much more scalable. It works very well. All of the pickup and all that stuff, I mean, that's not that complicated to do, but it does take some time. You're going to want to write, most of your pickup class functions are going to be, probably in your base item. That way, like, everything will do it. You don't have to be writing code multiple times. Put it in your base class, and then make your gear and your consumable, and they'll all just automatically work. Things like stackable and all that shit. I mean, the code for the to figure out how to make something, to determine whether something, let me say that again here. To display whether it's stackable in the UI is another adventure, and it's not that hard. But like if I have 4 keys on the ground, so I'll just show you. Basically, all you're doing is you're keeping track of that number in it's in your inventory, and your inventory keeps track of what items you have, right? So you have to have an inventory if you want to be able to do all this stuff. And so your inventory, and I can't go into the I cannot even make a video about how to make an inventory like this. This takes a lot of time. I mean, I could probably make a video, but it would be hard to understand because it's quite complex to make an inventory system that does all this, and you know, and when you drag an item out, it drops one key. I mean, that part of it's actually not that complicated, right? You're removing an item, but what's happening here is that when you have your inventory, when you have your inventory, um, and you are keeping track of the items that are in it, then you would tell every item to have a quantity. And like I said, I'm pretty sure. Let's actually just go here and see if it's in there. I think it's in here. I think there's an item count, but maybe not. No. Current stack count. That's what I use. Okay, so in your base class, you're going to have a current stack count. It's always going to be 1 until your inventory, you put more in your inventory. And your inventory is going to have all these functions like, it's gonna add you're adding the item to the slot, and the item already exists there. Then that's when you go and you're going to call your functions like increment stack count and decrement stack count and so forth, and moving items around and moving multiple stacks around, and it's, I mean, when you're moving something from one place to another and you have something already there, like for example we have this, and you move these, those that is just a switch. So you're taking an array value and an element in an array and you're switching it, and this item itself is keeping track of how many it already has, right? So you don't actually have 4 different elements of dungeon keys. You've got one element, one key, and that key has a count of 4. So it keeps track of that. And then when you actually pull out, all of them, then you have no more, right? And so you can pick them up again, and you can also and it knows to search through to find out whether or not you already have that item, right? Because you want to add that code in there too. You'll have to tell it, hey, I want to search through the entire inventory first when I go to pick up an item. And then, if that doesn't exist, now let's add it to the first available slot. But if it exists in there, then let's add it to that spot. Right, that's what we want. And of course, right-clicking and applying things. That's all stuff, if you're trying to build a game like this, it's and the other thing is I have like doors that will open based on whether or not you have keys. If I take all the keys out, I also don't have the ability to drop multiple items at once, but now the doors are, the ones that require keys are no longer accessible because you don't have a key. But if you put a key in, you can open it, and then if you put another key in, you can open that one, right? So that's kind of how that works for my anyway. You can grab, but the cool thing about the system is that the item can do its own job, right? So if I put an item in the world, it doesn't need to know anything. You just place it in the world and it will figure out what it needs to be, and then they can be used from the world just like that. You can place them in the world, you can pick them up from the world, and you can put them on, and once you have all that code for that stuff. I mean, okay, I'm gonna close that. So generally that's it. I mean, I hope that helps. I've pretty much went over everything, that all the differences between the current system that I have and the one that's in the tutorial. The logic behind the random generation isn't really that much different. It's just, like I said, it's a few changes that were, I guess, a few changes that made the system work a lot better. And I think that's pretty much it for what I'm going to talk about in this video. I don't really need to go over anything else, I don't think. The UI part of it, I'm trying to stay away from that because, like you guys, it's in the tutorial. It can be cleaned up. The tutorial has some. It's not the best. Like it could be, obviously, it could be improved the way that that handled functions and stuff. I did a lot of macros, which you don't need to do that. Um, it kind of sucks, but I did that back then, and I was like, well, um, I don't know. Let me see if I can just open my my item tooltip here, and then go in here. So basically, set all values. I have a similar function to what I had in the tutorial, right? It's very similar. I set the item name, I set the icon, I set the item level, I set the item color border. I set the color border, and um, these are the values coming straight from the item, right? The item is, at first, it's just a base item. This is just a base item that I'm passing through. Well, any of those subclasses can be a base item. So a gear can be a base item, right? It is a base item, but we're referencing it as a base item right now so that we can pull the information that directly relates to that, and we don't have to know whether or not it's a gear item or not, right? Because what we're going to do later is we're going to switch on what type it is. And then if it is a gear item, then it will do something specific. If it's a consumable, it'll do something specific, and resource and runestone and so forth. And so I don't like to use casts, but in this general sense, this is the easiest way to get what I'm trying to do across. Where the one item, you pull the item through, your UI goes, okay, I need to set some stuff, and then I need to know whether or not we're gear. If we're gear, we're going to cast to make sure that it's a gear item. If we don't fail that cast, then we can take our gear information and we can start setting all of our gear stuff, like our gear type, our enchant. Do we need to show the enchanted panel if it's enchanted? Our gear data. Is it a weapon? Okay, well, if it's a weapon, then we need to create the damage panel. If it's not, we need to create the armor panel. We need to create a primary stats panel. We need to create a secondary stats panel. We need to apply. These are just things that are getting drawn, and we're calling populate stats, which is a function that I talked about earlier, which was in that secondary stats function where it pulled the information from the item, right? That we're populating the stats, and then in fact populate stats is that function, right? And we're initializing the properties from that, so that's populate stats. So we go back here, and we add that to the panel, the vertbox panel. That was the original panel on this thing here. So it all gets added in order, and so let's go back to here, right? So we go secondary stats panel. Then we go, does it have a rune socket? Well, did it roll with a rune socket? Then we need to create the panel for that. And then what is the augmentation color theme? And those are things that I'm doing specifically. You wouldn't necessarily have those. And then we want to create a vendor panel at the bottom, right? So that's the very last thing, is a vendor panel. And then your consumables would be very similar. Set the consumable type, create a consumable panel, which is a panel that has information about the consumable. So each panel is a thing that you would create when you need it, right? And those panels are things that, like I said, they're very specific to that type of item, whatever it is. Like if it's a gear item, they're all going to be specific to the gear. If it's a consumable, it's all going to be specific to the consumable. And you take those panels and you create them when you need them. Set a level box state for consumable. I don't even remember what that is, but it's probably something that I was doing for level box. Let's find out. I don't even know what the fuck that is. I can't remember. I'd have to go back and look. But it doesn't matter because that's not what is being done is not what matters. It's how I'm doing it, right? So I can create another vendor panel over here on this one if I wanted to at the end, right? I don't do that currently, but I could. So my consumable, my key, could vendor if I wanted to. Let's actually try that. Let's go add a consumable, create a vendor panel, and let's just go here, and then let's go see if those dungeon keys now have a vendor panel on them. They probably will. And we're going to go in here. Look, see? Vendor price, 20 gold. And let's go close that. And let's not do that. And let's go here. No vendor panel. You see? That's because that one function, all it's doing is applying a panel and adding the value that exists. If you don't call the panel, the value still is there. You're just not displaying it. You're creating the panels on the fly when you need them. Resources haven't even finished, and runestones haven't even finished. So it's like, you just do what you need. And in any of these panels, if I just got rid of this, like in the gear, it just wouldn't draw it, right? I could skip that part, and I could go and pick up one of those weapons. It won't have that panel at all. It won't break the game. It won't stop working. It'll still work. I just won't have a damage panel on there, as you can see. I can still use the weapon. It just has no damage panel. It doesn't display it. But that doesn't mean I can't come over here and still do damage, because the damage is still in the weapon. It's just not going to display it because, and this is a fucking really crappy weapon. But I'm going to stop that right now. But, again, it's there. It's just not being displayed. Okay, anyway, I think you guys will understand. I think this is good enough to help you turn my previous tutorial into a much better system. It might take some time, like I said, too. And I know this is kind of a long video, but there's nothing else I can do about it. Like this kind of stuff takes time. But if you watch this whole thing and you were able to make it this far, I think that you can probably go back and pause all this stuff and, really figure out how to set it up using what I've given here. A lot of it's my secrets, but again, it's nice to be able to share my knowledge with other people. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and if you did like it, please, or if it's helpful, please like and subscribe. That helps out a lot. Alright, I will see you guys next time.